Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Bloomerang Academy. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Diana Otero, and I am the Product Engagement Manager at Bloomerang. You might recognize me from attending Bloomerang Academy classes or listening to our release and help videos. This week, we're talking about Bloomerang plus Zapier, everything you can do with Google Sheets. And today, we're focusing on mass updates with Google Sheets. So thank you for joining us today. I would like to introduce our presenter today, Jessie Gilchrist. Jessie is a Zapier certified expert and Bloomerang's integrations consultant at Sidekick Solutions. Sidekick Solutions is a Bloomerang partner specializing in system automations for Bloomerang. They have been a Bloomerang user since 2013 and most recently was part of the Bloomerang team that launched the Bloomerang Zapier app, which is a key component of today's webinar. We're excited to have Jessie here today to share her expertise and explore how you can use the Bloomerang Zapier app with Google Sheets to perform mass updates. Welcome, Jessie.
Thanks, Diana. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So I'm really excited about this webinar today. We get asked this question a lot about Google Sheets or just how to do mass updates with Bloomerang. So this is a webinar that is near and dear to my own heart. So the goal of our webinar today is to show how Bloomerang integrations and workflow automation with Google Sheets can streamline processes, save you time, and reduce effort. So we're going to start by introducing Bloomerang and Zapier, how they work together, and why Zapier integrations should be a key feature of your Bloomerang system and fundraising strategy. And then we're going to explore and demonstrate how you can use the Bloomerang Zapier app with Google Sheets to perform constituent mass updates and mass edits. Now, we have use cases throughout the presentation to show how you can implement these solutions at your organization to support your fundraising efforts and maintain clean data. As Diana mentioned, feel free to submit any questions during the presentation. I do have a couple breaks to answer questions, and then we should have more time for questions at the end. So let's go ahead and dive on in. So first, I want to start with a quick poll to see how many of you are using Zapier. And if you are using Zapier, if you're using it right now with Bloomerang. Also, let us know if you've heard of Zapier but never used it, or if this is the first time you're hearing of Zapier.
Thanks, Jessie, and thanks, everyone. It looks like we have an equal percentage, 41% have heard of Zapier before but never used it. We also have 41% whose first time it is hearing Zapier now, but we also have 11% who already have Zaps running with Bloomerang.
Oh, fantastic. I think this is one of the first webinars we've had on the Bloomerang Zapier app where people have actually already been using the Bloomerang Zapier app, so that's pretty exciting. But since there is a large percentage that are still pretty new to Zapier, let's go ahead and start by giving a high-level overview of what is Zapier and why we believe it's a key feature of your Bloomerang system and fundraising strategy. So you might be wondering why we're talking about Zapier when this presentation is about how to perform mass updates in Bloomerang using Google Sheets. And it really is a fair question that offers an exciting answer. Zapier is the software that enables additional Bloomerang integrations and a platform for automating day-to-day tasks that impact your organization's fundraising activities. It's the middleware that sits between your Bloomerang database and other apps like Google Sheets, helping them talk to each other. So at its core, Zapier is automation software. And with Zapier, you can build one integration or many, automating hundreds of tasks around your Bloomerang system within a single platform. So if that's not enough to get you excited about this, let's talk about why we at Sidekick Solutions get so excited about Bloomerang and Zapier integrations. So there's three primary reasons why we get excited when we talk about integration possibilities for Bloomerang. First, and most importantly, Zapier connects to over 2,000 other applications. Any app in Zapier's directory can be connected to your Bloomerang database. So if it's on Zapier's list, you can integrate it with Bloomerang, and that includes Google Sheets. So if you want to see what apps are available in the Zap directory, you can just go to zapier.com/apps, and it's going to give you the full list of the over 2,000 applications that are available on Zapier. You can search by an application's name, So again, we could look up and see that Bloomerang has an app in the Zapier directory, or you can also search by app categories. So if you have an app that you're thinking of, if this spurs any ideas for other apps you might want to integrate with Bloomerang, definitely go to zapier.com/apps and search to see if that application is available on Zapier's platform. The second reason we get excited about integrations between Zapier and Bloomerang is that Zapier was designed for anyone to build integrations. You don't need to know how to code to build Zaps, and anyone can build and maintain a Zap. We're going to walk through some builds today so you can get a feel for what that looks like. And then the last reason is that Zapier enables custom integrations, meaning that you aren't limited to a one-size-fits-all workflow, mapping, or formatting. You really can build the integration that is perfect for your organization and your workflows. Flexibility is especially important because every organization's fundraising strategy and data entry needs are different. Now, before we dive into the specifics for using Google Sheets to automate mass updates in Bloomerang, I want to talk about how mass updates via Bloomerang are different from how mass updates using Google Sheets are different from using Bloomerang imports. So there may be times when you are managing data in Bloomerang and you need to update or edit batches of constituent accounts. Depending on the number of accounts you need to update or edit, it may be cumbersome or even burdensome to modify the accounts one at a time in Bloomerang. This is where being able to mass update and mass edit constituent accounts can save your organization time and energy. And often we get asked about mass updates. Organizations are usually using that term mass update to categorize two different actions. Now, I want to talk through each of these as we intend to cover both use cases in this webinar today. So the first one I want to talk about is mass updates. So mass updates update every constituent account in your batch with the same data values for each account. Now, mass edits are a little bit different. They edit each constituent account in your batch with varying data and data values for each account. Mass updates and mass edits can both be integral data management practices to any fundraising strategy and provide a number of benefits to support the health of your database. Beyond increasing the speed of data entry, freeing up more time for other fundraising efforts, mass updates and edits provide clarity of data entry. You can see what you're modifying across an entire batch of constituent records instead of one at a time. And if during this presentation it sounds like I'm getting overly excited about updating information, just know that I'm one of those individuals that I am a huge data quality nerd. So the ability to do mass updates or mass edits using a Google Sheet and automating that process is near and dear to my own heart. So if you hear a lot of excitement in my voice, just know it's because this is something that I feel is really important for every organization. And the demos that we're going to share today really will help improve data quality and data entry best practices across your organization. So until integration with other applications via Zapier was possible, the only way to mass update or edit batches of constituent accounts was by exporting a report from Bloomerang, editing the data in Excel, and re-importing the file into Bloomerang. This process is still viable and may be a good fit for your organization. The biggest limitation, though, is that the amount of manual work that's required to pull a report from Bloomerang, edit it in Excel, and re-import the file back into Bloomerang. This is where automation can save your organization a significant amount of time and energy. So let's take a quick poll to see how many of you are familiar with mass updates and edits using the Bloomerang import tool. So let us know if you have performed mass updates or edits using Bloomerang imports, or maybe this is a concept that's completely new to you.
Thanks, Jessie, and thanks, everyone. It looks like we have 47% have completed a mass update or edit in Bloomerang before. 29% didn't know this was possible, and 26% knew about this but have not done it.
Oh, great. So it looks like we've got a mixture there. Okay. So before we dive into our demos, there's one more thing that we want to touch on. So there are some key points to be aware of when we talk about automating mass updates or mass edits using Google Sheets. And while these are somewhat technical, they're important considerations for the mass update and mass edit process. So using the mass edit or update process with Google Sheets, you can add new values to any field in the database. You can overwrite data in any constituent custom field. You can promote a new constituent address, phone, or email as the primary. And this will demote any existing primary information to a secondary set. This can only be done with automation, not via imports. And then the other piece to keep in mind is that you cannot make a field blank. So if it isn't already blank in your database before starting the mass update or edit process, the mass update or edit process cannot blank that field out or remove existing data in that field. It's important to keep these key points in mind because they will affect how you manage and map data in your mass update and mass edit integration workflows. So let's go ahead and dive into our first use case. So for our first use case, we are going to showcase how you can use an integration with Google Sheets to create a mass edit process for a custom constituent field. This is a great place to start because it's an easy automation to set up and will help streamline the assignment of solicitors for major gift donors. In this use case, we're going to create a Google Sheet list of constituents who make a gift of $1,000 or more who do not have a value in our solicitor or prospect status fields. From this list, we'll then be able to assign a value in these custom constituent fields and push the assignments back to Bloomerang to update the constituents record. Now, the amazing thing about automations is that this all happens in real time. Our Zapier workflows will trigger every time a new $1,000 or higher donation is entered in Bloomerang. And the data will sync back to Bloomerang from the Google Sheets once we identify in the sheet that the constituent's updated coding is good to go. So before we start actually building this in Zapier, the first thing we want to do is make sure our fields are set up in Bloomerang. So on our constituent record in Bloomerang, you can see that on the profile, we have two custom fields set up that we're going to use in this integration. In our prospect management category, we have a solicitor field and a prospect status field. And if I edit these, you can see the field types. So our solicitor is a drop-down field. We have our different solicitors available. In our prospect status, we have our status field as well. So having your custom fields set up in Bloomerang ahead of time is really important and will streamline the setup of your Zap. Now, when we're talking about integrations with Google Sheets, the first step for any integration is actually setting up the structure for our Google Sheet itself. So in our Google Sheet, you can see right here, I've got a demo set up. We want to set up the columns that represent the data we want to write to the spreadsheet, and then this will allow us to build our integration in Zapier. So when we talk about sending data from a Google Sheet back to Bloomerang, we want to add a column either on the far left or the far right, and we call this our trigger column. Now, after making updates to a row, we would type send in this trigger column to indicate that the constituent record and update should be pushed to Bloomerang. We're going to leave this column blank for now, and we'll show how this works once we get our Zap set up. If you've watched or attended any of our other Bloomerang and Zapier webinars, you'll notice that this workflow here is a little bit different in the sense that it needs two different Zaps. So these colored workflow steps here, this first section up here, these first three, that's our first Zap, and then the bottom three down here, this is our second Zap. So these mass update and mass edit processes using Zapier require two separate Zaps. one to write data to our Google Sheet from Bloomerang, and then one to send the data from from the Google Sheet back to Bloomerang. So again, a little bit more unique than what you've seen in our past Bloomerang and Zapier webinars. So if you've attended any of those, just know that this is a little bit different in the sense that we need two separate Zaps. So once we've set up our Google Sheet with our columns for our Bloomerang data, and then our trigger column for sending to Bloomerang, we're going to hop into Zapier. And of course, the Zoom menu at the top likes to hover over my Chrome tabs. So we're in our Zapier account. We're going to click Make a Zap. So our workflow is going to start when we have a new donation in Bloomerang of $1,000 or more. So our trigger, we're going to select our Bloomerang Zapier app. And our trigger event is going to be a new transaction. We're going to click Continue. I'm going to select my Bloomerang account. And then this is where I can set the filters for what types of transactions I want to trigger my workflow. So in this instance, I'm going to choose transactions that have revenue associated. So I'm going to choose a donation, recurring donation payment, or a pledge payment. Now I'm going to say that not only do I only want those types of transactions to trigger my workflow, but also the transaction amount needs to be $1,000 or greater. So that again limits it down to just our major donors. Now down here, we can choose to include the constituent's cumulative giving history or their household information. For this workflow, we don't need the household information, so I'm going to leave that blank. But I am going to include the constituent's cumulative giving history because I want to map the constituent's lifetime revenue to my Google Sheet, because this will help me identify which solicitor I want to assign for my organization. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to true so that when the transaction data hits Zapier, it also pulls in the constituent's cumulative giving history so we can get that lifetime revenue amount. So when I click continue, this is where we can test our trigger, and this will pull in sample data from our Bloomerang database. So it's going to pull in recent transactions that meet our criteria, and then we can use those transactions to map to the corresponding fields in our Google Sheet. So you can see that it returned 3 sample transactions that I could use. I'm just going to use the first one here. Now, once we've set up our trigger, the next step we want to do is we want to add a filter. And so we're going to use the Zapier Filter app. And what we want to do is we want to only continue and write the constituents' information to our Google Sheet if they do not have a primary solicitor or a prospect status assigned. So if they already have values in those fields, we don't want to write it to the Google Sheet because there is no assignment needed. So we're going to go ahead, and the first thing we're going to do is we are going to pull in our prospect status right here. And we're going to say prospect status does not exist. So we're only going to continue if they don't have a prospect status. Or we're going to again search for our solicitor field and say we're only going to continue if that doesn't exist. So it allows us to do and or criteria when we're doing our filter. So we're going to say we're only going to continue if prospect status is empty or if solicitor is empty. And again, this is just a way to make sure that our 2 primary fields for prospect management in our Bloomerang database are going to have values assigned for our major donors. So I can go ahead and click continue. And you'll see that it tests my filter for me and lets me know that my Zap would have continued because the test transaction that I pulled in, that constituent didn't have a prospect status or a solicitor assigned. So I can click done editing, and then I'm going to add my step that will actually write the Bloomerang data now to my Google Sheet. So I'm going to use Google Sheets as my app. My action event is that I'm going to create a new spreadsheet row. Click continue. I'm going to select my Google Sheets account. And then I need to look up my Google Sheet. So I'm going to look up my Bloomerang Google Sheet here for my demo. And I can choose the specific worksheet in that sheet that I want to use. So we're going to use our solicitor mass edit right here. And you can see that when I select the appropriate spreadsheet and worksheet, it pulls in fields for all of the columns that we set up in our sheet. So you can see we have the trigger column of send to Bloomerang, constituent ID, account number, and then the additional fields that we wanted to pull in as well. So now what we want to do is we want to pull in the data from our trigger, so from that new transaction, and map it to the corresponding fields. So the constituent ID field, the reason why we include this beyond just the account number, so you can see right here in this demo sheet, the constituent ID is a unique ID number per account in your Bloomerang database that is used primarily for integrations. So it serves a similar purpose to account number, but is more kind of integration friendly. So in order to make our workflow when we push this data from the Google Sheet back to Bloomerang more streamlined, we will actually use that constituent ID number. So we want to make sure that that is in our Google spreadsheet so that when we do the workflow to send the data back to Bloomerang, we don't need to use a search step to find the constituent. We can use that unique ID number for that constituent. So I'm going to go ahead and from my new transaction in Bloomerang trigger and that sample transaction that pulled in, I'm going to pull in, it's actually called the account ID. I'm going to pull in my account number, and you can see that this operates really similar to almost like a merge process with Word, if you're familiar with that, where we are just going to map the fields that correspond to our columns. So I'm going to pull in my constituent type. I'm going to pull in my full name for my account. I'm going to pull in again, because we chose to include the cumulative giving history, I can pull in my lifetime giving revenue for that constituent. Again, just some additional information to help pull in to review and when assigning that solicitor. And then I'm actually going to map in solicitor and prospect status. And the reason why I'm mapping these in is because if you remember, we set our filter so that if one of these fields was blank, it's going to write to our Google Sheet. So I want to make sure when it writes to the Google Sheet, if there is data in either of these fields, we want to make sure it writes into our Google Sheet so we can see what data has already been assigned, whether that be a solicitor or a prospect status. And so at this point, we'd be able to click continue and turn this workflow on to start syncing data from Bloomerang to our Google Sheet. So I already have another one set up and for our Google Sheet. So let's go ahead and enter a donation over here. I'm going to enter it on Sherlock's account. Just going to enter a new donation. And we're going to enter a $1,500 donation. Okay. So once I save that donation, as I mentioned, this runs in relative real time. So it might take a few seconds for, or even up to a minute perhaps, for the transaction to sync over to your Bloomerang sheet or to your Google Sheet. You can see just as quickly as we entered that, you can see Sherlock got added right here. And we have some conditional formatting set up to show us that the fields for solicitor and prospect status are blank. And then also reminding us that we should enter send to then send that transaction to Bloomerang once we've assigned the solicitor and prospect status. So you can see how quickly that information populates over to the Google Sheet for you to then be able to update and assign the solicitor and prospect status. Now, in order to send any assigned solicitor and prospect status back to Bloomerang for this constituent, we need to set up our second Zap. So we just set up our first Zap, and now we would need to set up a second one. So I'm just going to go back to my dashboard. And I'm going to click Make a Zap again. And this time, instead of wanting to sync data from Bloomerang to Google Sheets, we are going to start with Google Sheets and sync the data back to Bloomerang. So we are going to choose the trigger that is the newer updated spreadsheet row and click continue. We're going to choose our Google Sheets account. And then same as we did before, we're going to select our spreadsheet and our worksheet within that spreadsheet. And then it allows us to select our trigger column. So in this instance, we don't want to trigger if there's a change to any column in our Google Sheet. We only want to trigger if there's a change in what we are considering our trigger column, which is that send to Bloomerang column. And so it's only going to trigger our workflow if there's a change to that column. So we're going to click continue. I'm going to test my trigger. Again, this is going to pull in a sample from my spreadsheet here. So then we can set up the rest of the mapping. So once I've got my sample, I'm going to click continue. Now, in case there's ever a change to that trigger column, so something other than send is entered in column A in your Google Sheet, the next step we recommend is actually to create essentially another filter step like we did in the first workflow. So we're going to add a filter. And in this instance, we're only going to have the workflow continue if that trigger column, so what we're calling send to Bloomerang, if it matches send. So we only want to continue the workflow and actually update the constituents information in Bloomerang if we've actually triggered it to send. So this is a great way to kind of make sure that if your team happens to enter any random notes in this column A, it's not going to sync data that either hasn't been updated yet, or maybe you're considering which solicitor or prospect status to assign. It's not going to sync that over to Bloomerang until you're ready. So you want to make sure that whatever text you want to be your trigger, again, whether you're entering send, whether it's an X or some other type of phrase your organization wants to use, setting up this filter will make sure that anything else that's entered in that column isn't going to sync to Bloomerang. So I'm going to go ahead and click continue. And then we're going to add our step to go ahead and update our constituent in Bloomerang. So we're going to select our Bloomerang app and choose to update our constituent as our action. Now, since we chose to pull the constituent ID right here into our Google spreadsheet, we can go straight to the update constituent action. If we didn't include that constituent ID when writing to the Google Sheet, we would want to include at least one piece of contact information when writing to that Google Sheet. And then we would need to use a find step to find the constituent using their name and at least one of address, phone, or email. So that does add an additional step in your workflow, which adds a task in Zapier, can impact your subscription costs. So it really is kind of a best practice to make sure you're including that constituent ID. So you can go straight to the update constituent step and don't need that find constituent search in there. So we're going to update constituent, select our Bloomerang account. And then in the constituent field, this is where we will map our constituent ID. So you can see that it returns a list of all of the accounts in our database, and the little number in gray below them is the ID. So to make this a dynamic workflow that's going to look up the constituent based off of the constituent ID in our Google Sheet, we're going to click custom. And then in the newer updated spreadsheet row, this is where we're going to select our constituent ID field or column from our worksheet. And then we can come down and we will look through, it's going to populate all standard and custom fields on the constituent profile in Bloomerang. We're going to go down because the only two fields we want to modify in our workflow is going to be solicitor and prospect status. So we are actually just going to scroll down to our two fields here. So we have our solicitor field and our prospect status. We're going to select the drop down and click custom, and then select the column from our worksheet, from our Google worksheet. So we're going to map in our solicitor that's assigned in our worksheet and our prospect status. Now, once we map those two fields in, because those are the only two fields we want to modify, we can go ahead and turn our Zap on and go ahead and watch that data sync back to Bloomerang. So we're going to go ahead back to Google Sheets. And again, I already have a Zap turned on. So we're going to say that for Sherlock, we're going to assign a solicitor of Jason Oliver, and we're going to put a prospect status of pending. And so once in the send to Bloomerang field, I enter send, you're going to see, and again, this might take a second here. So I'm going to give it just a second to refresh. But this is going to push this update of Jason Oliver pending back to Bloomerang to update Sherlock's profile. So if we go onto the profile now, you can see that in our prospect management category, in our custom fields, we have our solicitor of Jason Oliver and our prospect status of pending. Now, an important thing to note is if you are assigning values in any field that is not a text field in Bloomerang, so for example, our solicitor and our prospect status fields were drop downs, the values you assign in your Google Sheet need to match the values you already have in your database. So if I wanted to assign a solicitor or create a new prospect status, I'd want to make sure that my field in Bloomerang is already set up with that corresponding value to be able to accept that in. So before we move on to the next workflow, I want to take a minute to see if there are any questions. Again, there's quite a bit that we covered here. Oops, and I think I went through too many slides there. Let me go back. Trying to get to my question slide. I guess I had quite a bit here. I might have actually missed my question slide. So Diana, do we have any questions that we can tackle real quick before we move on to the next demonstration?
Yes, Jessie, we have a nice question here. I think that's why use Google Sheets? Would this process also work with Excel?
Yeah, so at Sidekick, we lean heavily into Google Sheets. It is a very integration-friendly product. Google products as a whole, I would say, are very integration-friendly. Now, you can create similar workflows with Microsoft Office products like Excel. We have encountered some issues if you do any sorting or filtering in Excel. So just something to be careful of if you do choose to use Excel over Google Sheets. I would say just use it with a little bit of caution and do some testing to make sure that your data is flowing back to Bloomerang the way you intended. And I would also kind of refrain from doing any sorting or filtering within your Excel spreadsheet, as we have seen some issues with that in the past. Again, comes down to your organization's preference on Google Sheets versus Excel. But similar concepts and workflows should also work with Excel as we're demonstrating here for Google Sheets.
Great, thanks, Jessie.
Any other questions? Are we good to move on to our next demo?
We're good for now.
Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and move on to our next one. So for many organizations, data quality in their CRM is a big concern and can create headaches when trying to use that data for targeted solicitations and appeals. With many users entering data into a single system, data entry rules can often vary, resulting in discrepancies in constituent coding and data formatting. So in this next use case, we're going to create a Google Sheet of newly created constituent accounts. And from this list, we can review and make edits in batch to a large number of accounts quickly to ensure all accounts are coded correctly in Bloomerang. This is especially important to ensure data used for salutations and recognition follows your organization's preferred data entry rules. So as I mentioned, I'm a huge data quality person, so this is one that I feel like has an application for almost every organization, especially if you're using other integrations to create constituents in Bloomerang. So if you have data flowing from other apps into Bloomerang, this kind of data quality review process using a Google Sheet can be really helpful to make sure the data that's writing into your system from another application is writing into your system in the way that you intend for it to, and allow for any modifications that you need to make to ensure data quality and consistency across your database. So just like the last demonstration, we would start by setting up the structure for our Google Sheet. So I have another demo sheet here. And in this one, we're going to focus on making sure that our name and our titles, informal, formal, envelope name, and recognition name are all consistent for our organization's data entry rules. So similar to what we did for the solicitor mass edit, we want to make sure that we have column headers in our Google Sheet that represent the data we want to write to the spreadsheet. And then again, have our trigger column either on the far right or on the far left so that we can enter the word send or an X or whatever our organization prefers to trigger the sending of this data back to Bloomerang to update the constituent record. So similar to the last workflow, we're going to build 2 Zaps. So I'm going to go back to my Zapier dashboard and I'm going to click Make a Zap. And for this one, we are going to trigger on the creation of a new constituent in Bloomerang. So I'm going to select Bloomerang as my triggering app. And for my trigger event, instead of new transaction, I'm going to choose new constituent. Select my Bloomerang account. And then if I want to, I can filter down which type of constituents I want to review. So I could choose to review individuals or organizations. If I leave this blank, it's going to trigger on both types, syncing newly created individuals and organizations to my Google Sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this blank. So I'm going to go ahead and click Continue. So let's go ahead and test our trigger to bring in a sample transaction, or sorry, sample constituent. So again, it's going to bring in 3 recently created constituents that I can use for mapping. I'm going to click Continue. Now for this workflow, we don't need a filter step like we did in the last one, because for every new constituent, we want to write them to our Google Sheet to make sure we can review for data quality and consistency. So similar to what we did before, we're going to create a spreadsheet row in our Google Sheet. Select our Google Sheets account. Select our spreadsheet. And then the corresponding worksheet that we want to use. And again, it's going to pull in all of our columns from our Google Sheet. And as a reminder, again, if you pull in that constituent ID, it's going to make your Zap that's going to send the data from the Google Sheet back to Bloomerang simpler, much easier to set up. It also ensures that you are absolutely writing that data back to the correct constituent account. So having that constituent ID, again, best practice, cannot recommend it enough. Make sure that is in your Google Sheet for easy syncing back to Bloomerang. And then we're going to map in our fields for our newly created constituents. So we're going to pull in our ID. We're going to pull in our account number. And we can go down. So we'd map in our constituent type, the name, and then all of the other fields that we're wanting to include in our Google Sheet. So we have the different name fields for individual accounts. And then we have our informal name, formal name, envelope name, and recognition name. And again, the mapping for these works just the same as we showcased in the last Zap, where you can just type in the field that you're wanting to pull in and it'll search for it. And then you can click to map it right in there. So I already have this Zap set up. So if we go ahead and we create a new constituent in Bloomerang and create a new individual here, call Susan Seashell. So I'm going to go ahead and map this information in, and we're going to go ahead and put a title for her. And I'm going to go ahead and click Save. So this is creating my new account in Bloomerang. And again, we'll give it just a second here, but it will go ahead and populate over to our Google Sheet, where then we can review for any information that we want to change on that account. So you can see there's Susan Seashell, the new account we just created. And you can see all the fields that we've mapped in for this account. Now, in the one that I'd set up earlier as a demo that's live, it doesn't actually have the title field mapped. But you can see we have the title still pulling in for those formal, envelope, and recognition names from our database. So now it's time to set up our second Zap that once we trigger Susan or Robert's account to send back to Bloomerang, we'll send the data back to Bloomerang. So we'll want to go back to Zapier, and we're going to set up to or click to make another Zap. And so similar to like we did before, we're going to make a Zap, and we're going to trigger on an updated row in our Google Sheet. So we're going to select our Google Sheets, an updated spreadsheet row, select our Google Sheets account. I'm going to select our spreadsheet and our worksheet within that spreadsheet. And then our trigger column, similar to the last one, we're going to choose our send to Bloomerang column that we've set up as our trigger. Test our trigger to pull in a row. Again, we're just to use for mapping. And then same as before, we're going to add a filter where we only want to continue if that trigger column is whatever phrase our organization wants to use to send to Bloomerang. So we're going to say send. And then again, similar to as before, we have triggering off of our updated row in our Google Sheet. We're filtering to exclude any rows from sending to Bloomerang unless it says send in our trigger column. And then because we have the constituent ID already in our Google Sheet, we can go straight to that update constituent action. Select our Bloomerang account. And then we can map in all the fields that we would want to update for that constituent. So I'm going to map in my constituent using the ID number from the Google Sheet. And then in this instance, I'm really concerned in this demo that we're doing on changes we want to make to informal name, formal name, envelope name, and recognition name. So back in my Zap, I'm going to go ahead and map those fields for my Google Sheet. Informal, formal, envelope, and recognition. And so at this point, I'd be able to turn my workflow on and be able to sync data from my Google Sheet back to Bloomerang. So again, I have one of these already set up. So let's say that we want to change Robert. Robert is his formal name, but for the informal name, we want to change his to Bob. We're okay with it saying Mr. Billings, Mr. Robert Billings for envelope and recognition. For informal name, let's say she really likes Susie. And so we actually want to update all of our names for Susan Seashell to say Susie. So you can see I've made those changes here in my in my Google Sheet. And then I can come over here and enter send to send that data to Bloomerang. And then let's go ahead and hop back into Bloomerang. And let's go to Robert's account first. And you can see that if we go to Robert's profile, you can see that his informal name updated to Bob, which is the change we made in our Google Sheet. And if I go to Susie's account, you can see that we've updated not only her informal name, but also her envelope name and her recognition name, both updated based off of the changes we made in our Google Sheet. So as you can see, there's a lot of ways that you can use Google Sheets to not only maintain data quality in your Bloomerang system, but to also help automate the assignment of special coding for different constituent values, whether they be standard fields in Bloomerang or custom fields that you've set up. So in kind of wrapping up and bringing this full circle, I want to leave you with a handful of ways you might use Google Sheets to do mass updates or mass edits to support your fundraising efforts. So maybe you want to assign a constituent code of event participant when a constituent makes a donation, buys an event ticket, or has another event-related transaction in Bloomerang. You could have these specific transaction types right to a Google Sheet, and then use an update constituent step in that secondary workflow to sync a code of event participant back to the constituent in Bloomerang. You could write all membership transactions to a Google Sheet and then use that Google Sheet to update the constituent's membership expiration date in a custom field on their profile. And then one of my favorites is that you could populate values in a new constituent custom field for all or a segment of your constituents in Bloomerang. So the possibilities for Bloomerang mass updates and mass edits using Google Sheets are nearly endless and really should be customized to automate your unique workflows and coding. More than anything, it's going to save your organization a lot of time by allowing you to update accounts really quickly and ensure that your constituents in your database are coded in alignment with your best practices and data entry rules, but also to maintain that data consistency. Now, with the flexibility of Google Sheets, it could be interpreted that we are advocating for using spreadsheets to replace data entry and direct navigation within Bloomerang. That's not the case. We believe that Bloomerang is your central system and that integrations supplement your Bloomerang database. Data entry, reporting, and automation should start from a lens that Bloomerang is core to your donor management and fundraising technology. Google Sheets only supplements and extends Bloomerang. It doesn't replace it. And so the next step is really getting started. You sign up for a Zapier account. Zapier does have a 14-day free trial and has a free plan up to certain limits. And if you need to bump up to a paid plan, they do offer a discount for nonprofits. Connect your Bloomerang and Google Sheets accounts to Zapier. Set up a Zap for Bloomerang and Google Sheets, customizing it to match your workflow and mapping requirements. And then turn on your Zap and monitor it. Watch as tasks queue in your task history, resolve any errors that come up, and high-five yourself for successes. I know that this can often be a complicated process. And so as Diana introduced me before, my name is Jessie Gilchrist. My email's up here on the screen and my door is always open. If you'd like to work with a consultant to set up Zaps or develop a custom Bloomerang integration to address a unique use case, please don't hesitate to reach out. Sidekick Solutions, we have a team of integration experts that are ready and happy to help you with any integration conundrum or use case that you've come across. So please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always happy to help. So I'm going to hand it off to Diana for a quick poll before we open up for some more questions.
Thank you so much, Jessie. That was a lot of awesome information. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. If you would like a follow-up about consulting services to set up integrations with Bloomerang through Zapier, not just with Google Sheets, but maybe you're using a similar app, you can also get in touch with Sidekick Solutions or let us know and we'll have someone reach out. In the meantime, I'll leave that poll up and let's answer some questions. Jessie, is it possible to add a column to the Google Sheet which does a calculation based on data brought in from Bloomerang and then send it back to Bloomerang?
Yes, so that is a great question. So Google Sheets is, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, Google Sheets is a very versatile tool. So yes, if you have some type of a calculation or a conversion or some type of formula you want to add into your Google Sheet, you can absolutely do that because Google Sheets will perform that calculation near instantaneously when your data is first populated in. It'll run that calculation, and then when you send that data to go back to Bloomerang, that column that has the calculation in it will pull in essentially as a string or a text or a field value that you could map into a standard or a custom field in that update constituent step. So brief yes, no answer. Yes, you can use calculations in a Google Sheet and have the output of that calculation right back to a standard or custom field in Bloomerang.
Awesome. Would restricting permissions on the ID column or any column, so let's say a volunteer doesn't actually change certain fields, keep the Zap from running?
That's a great question. No. So restricting columns that you don't want to be edited, especially if you're using volunteers for data entry, it's a great idea. I'm probably actually going to start implementing that on some of the Zaps I set up for myself so I don't accidentally modify data sometimes. But yes, that is a great idea. Adding any restrictive permissions are not going to impact the ability of the Zap to run, especially because the way we've demonstrated these demos today are only going to trigger when there's an update to the trigger column. And then if you remember, we have that filter set up so that from there, once it triggers based off of a change in that trigger column, it's only going to continue if that trigger column matches whatever phrase or, trigger text our organization wants to use. So restricting permissions on a single column in that spreadsheet, not going to impact anything. And I think that's actually a really great kind of enhancement to any workflow that I think, especially when you're using that constituent ID, to ensure that that doesn't get modified is absolutely restrict that. And I would restrict any other columns that you don't want to be modified as well. So in that last use case where we were looking at informal name, formal name, envelope name, and recognition, if we wanted to make sure that we weren't editing perhaps the existing name fields or the type for the constituent account, we could restrict those other data columns and only make the informal name, formal name, envelope name, and recognition name editable. So permissions in Google Sheets is a really great idea to make sure that only the data that you're wanting to edit or modify can be edited, and any other columns or data that's brought in for reference, maintains its integrity. So I think that's a really great question that was brought up, and a great piece that I would actually strongly encourage for any organization that's looking at doing a Google Sheet integration for mass updates or edits.
That's a fantastic idea. Thank you so much for that question, Erin. Is the send to Bloomerang field case sensitive?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's a couple of ways that you can set up your filter in Zapier. One would be to have it be case sensitive, and the other one would be not. So we prefer to do it case sensitive. Again, just kind of common practice that we do at Sidekick. And so I've said exactly matches send, but you can say contains send, and it will allow it to be non-case sensitive. So it's something that you can play with at your organization. We always recommend that whatever you're using for your trigger text, to make it really straightforward. Some organizations prefer that instead of the word send, they just want to put an X. So really comes down to your preference, or some will say send, or, good to go. Again, this is the beauty of Zapier and integrations between Bloomerang with Zapier and then any other app you're using, is that you can customize it to how it works best for you. But exactly matches is going to have more of that, really close. Now, in terms of, actually, I think the question was about field case sensitive. I don't believe it is, actually, let me backtrack. I don't believe it's field case sensitive. So the difference between send and send shouldn't cause an issue in terms of triggering from your Google Sheet. So if one is all caps and one is normal sentence case, shouldn't cause an issue for triggering. But the exactly matches is really important. I would say that would be my biggest recommendation, is just to make sure that whatever text you're wanting to trigger on, again, maybe it's you're wanting to use X, and whether it's uppercase or lowercase, the exactly matches is important to make sure that, if that same string happens to be in a random note that a team member has added in that column, it's not going to accidentally trigger it to send to Bloomerang. So exactly matches, again, this is more characters. In terms of field case sensitivity, no, I do not believe that it requires field case sensitivity. It's more kind of character for character matching, whether it's an exact match or you want to just trigger if it contains that wording in there or that string.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessie. In terms of updating custom fields in Bloomerang, can you update custom fields elsewhere? For example, note custom fields or interaction custom fields instead of just on the donor profile?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is a more advanced integration concept, and it can be accomplished with custom calls to the Bloomerang API. So it's not something that can be done with the Bloomerang Zapier app out of the box. The only update action available for the Bloomerang Zapier app is update constituent. So if you have a use case where you would want to update some other type of record, so an interaction, a note, a transaction, anything like that, feel free to reach out to us at Sidekick and we can talk through what the possibilities are for that. But that is a more advanced and a more custom integration workflow than what you'd be able to do with the Bloomerang Zapier app.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessie. I've gone ahead and linked the page for Bloomerang on Zapier so everybody can check out the triggers and apps and actions there. But if there's something that you're wanting to do but are not sure if it's possible, you can always reach out to our friends at Sidekick Solutions because they might be able to have a solution for you. Right, Jessie?
Absolutely. I mean, integrations are what we do day in and day out. We use them internally ourselves to automate most of our admin and operational related tasks. And so we love troubleshooting and trying to figure out how to automate your specific use case. So even if you have an idea and you don't know if it's possible, but it's something that would save you time or save you effort, please reach out and let us know, and we can talk about whether it's a possibility and what it would take to get that solution put in place for you. So we are here. We're open to talking about integrations. We love talking about integrations. We really think that it's the future for nonprofits, and Bloomerang is a fantastic tool when it comes to integrating with the other applications your organization is using, as well as using Bloomerang with other tools like Google Sheets to even streamline or ensure data quality and consistency across your Bloomerang database.
Well, thank you everyone again for joining us today. We hope that you can find a way to automate your processes and focus on building those relationships. So thank you everyone again for being with us this afternoon. Thank you so much, Jessie, for all that wonderful information. And we hope we see everyone again in another Academy class soon. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.